Howdy. So I'm recording tomorrow's video today, because that's how I roll. So today I just want to tell you a story. It's all the background information about Judaism leading up to the 1st century. And I thought this would be helpful because every book I've read that is on the historical Jesus always has this chapter about background information just to give you an idea of the world in which Jesus came into. And it really sheds a lot of light, I think, on the Gospels and early Christianity. So it's not necessary to believe that everything in this story is true, because the main thing is that this is the story that informed 1st century Jews. It kind of formed their worldview or whatever. Some of it is true, some of it is demonstrably true, like the Babylonian exile, that kind of stuff. So anyway, Judaism was a religion that kind of built up over history. The worldview was shaped by historical events, like the Babylonian exile, but it was also shaped by their worldview. Their history was shaped by their worldview. I mean, the whole reason they went to war against Rome was in large part informed by their worldview, their idea that their God was the one true God and they were their chosen people, and God would vindicate them and everything. That's kind of what gave them motive. But anywho, let me just start with Abraham. Abraham lived a long, long time ago, 1,500 years ago or something like that. I'm not really sure. Or not 1,500 years ago, but 1,500 years before Jesus. So anywho, Abraham, I guess, was from what's modern day Iraq, around that area, Mesopotamia. And he went to what's now Israel, or has been called the land of Palestine or whatever. And he was standing around looking, and God said, Abraham, I'm going to give you all this land, and all this land is going to belong to you and your descendants forever. That's a really big deal in the Jewish worldview. They had all these symbols, like in promises that they had from God. God promised them this land. There was a promise that there would always be a man on the throne of David, that God may punish them by sending them into exile, but he would always bring them back to the land, And so Jewish people always believe that their fidelity to the law. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me just tell the story in chronological order and let you draw your own conclusions. So okay, so Abraham was promised all this land, and he had 2 kids. He had Isaac and Ishmael, and this promise was given to Isaac, and Ishmael was sent away. And then Isaac had 2 kids. He had Jacob and Esau. And this promise went to Jacob and not to Esau. And so Jacob had 12 kids, and these 12 kids became the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel later on. And through a series of unfortunate events, I won't go into detail about that, they ended up in Egypt. And they were in Egypt for 400 years, I think, and they became slaves there in the process. And at the end of that, God called Moses to liberate them. And Moses, through a series of aggressive negotiations with he didn't negotiate with a lightsaber. That's what you're thinking. But they were aggressive negotiations nonetheless with Pharaoh. Eventually, they got out of Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, or whatever you want to call it. And God split the water, and they walked across, and they wandered in the desert for 40 years. And God gave them the law from Mount Sinai, gave it to Moses. And Moses came down with, the 15 commandments, and then he dropped one, and it became the 10 commandments. I'm a dad, so I'm allowed to make dad jokes along the way. That's a reference to Monty Python. So anyway, there was actually just 10 commandments, but there were 613 laws altogether. And these were the laws that would govern Israel. They were supposed to last forever, so even when they weren't governing themselves, they still kind of keep these laws as far as possible. Anywho, getting ahead of myself again. So they wandered in the desert for 40 years, and finally, after Moses died, Joshua became their leader, and he led them into the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham. And the Canaanites were living in the land at the time, and so they had all these wars against the Canaanites, and they eventually conquered, and they took over the land, and they settled in it. And up until this time, they had this tabernacle set up. Well, let me back. Yeah, they had this tabernacle set up, and this tabernacle acted as kind of their temple, and the high priest would go in there. Oh, yeah, part of the law was the founding of the priesthood, the Aaronic priesthood. So these priests were anointed. Aaron was anointed, and then Aaron anointed his sons. And by anointing, I mean literally with oil, put oil on their earlobes. You know, they had all these ceremonies and stuff, and they were the ones that were to officiate over the tabernacle, which acted as kind of the temple. And they lit incense in there, and the incense, or the smoke or whatever that filled the Holy of Holies, the room or whatever, represented the Shekinah, which means the presence of God. I'm probably mispronouncing that too. So they believed that God was with them, you know. And so for a number of years, I don't know how many years, these 12 tribes, one of the tribes was the Levites, and those were the ones that officiated as priests. They were like the descendants of Aaron and his family, I guess. I'm not really sure how that works. But anyway, the other 11 tribes, you know, had their own partition land. And so they were kind of like a confederacy because there wasn't a central government. They were ruled by judges. And this happened for a number of years. I don't know how many years. And finally, one day, and this story is told, I think, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the Israelites, Samuel was a prophet. And like, I guess, the prophet at the time. And they asked Samuel to ask God to give them a king. They wanted to be like all the nations around them. And Samuel's like, well, they're rejecting my leadership. And he goes to God, and God says, oh, it's not you they're rejecting. They're rejecting me as their king. But God nevertheless gave them a king. And God told Samuel to anoint this guy named Saul, anoint him as king. And just as the priests were anointed as priests, Saul was literally anointed as king. In Europe, you know, they crown people as king, or they used to crown people as king. In Israel, they anointed people as king. Anointing, the word for anointing is Mashiach, and that's where we get the word Messiah. And Messiah means the same thing as the Greek word Christos, which means anointed, and that's where we get the word Christ. So Messiah and Christ both mean the same thing. So an anointed one can refer to a priest, or it can refer to a king, but it can also refer to a priest or a prophet. Prophets can also be anointed. But the primary usage is it's usually referred to a priest or a king. So Saul became king of Israel, but he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord decided to replace him, and replaced him with David. And at the time, David was just this, well, in the beginning, David was just this shepherd boy, you know, and he's the one that flung the rock and killed the Philistine. And so later on, he became like a military commander under Saul, and he was very loyal to Saul, even though Saul was jealous of David, and Saul was trying to hunt him down. And I'm going into way too much detail here that you don't need to know. But basically, David ended up being anointed king. Now, when David was king, he really wanted to build the temple of the Lord. And God wouldn't let him, because David was a man of violence. He was a military leader. And so God told him that his son would build the temple. And so he also made this promise to David that there would always be a man on the throne of David, that Israel would always have a man on the throne of David. And when David died, God made the same promise to Solomon, but he qualified it. He said, as long as your sons are obedient to me, there will always be a man on the throne of David. And Solomon built the first temple, and the first temple replaced the tabernacle, and they had the Holy of Holies in there, and the Shekinah of God. And so this is kind of the ideal. This is like the golden age of the Hebrew people. They had their land that was promised to them. They had their temple with the presence of God among them. They had the law that they were keeping, and they had the wisest king they ever had, Solomon. They were unified. everything was going great. Things were prospering. And then, and they had all these promises, you know, that the Davidic dynasty would last forever. And then Solomon died, and there was a disagreement among his children about who would be king. And this disagreement ended up in the kingdom of Israel being split in two. And so you had the northern section, which became the kingdom of Israel, and they were composed of 10 tribes. And then you had the southern kingdom of Judah, which was composed of 2 tribes, one of those tribes being the tribe of Judah. And the word Judah is where we get the word Jew. Jews were the people from the tribe of Judah, or from the kingdom of Judah. So this split lasted a long time, and sometimes they had wars between themselves. But a lot of the literature in the Bible comes from both sides. So I think around 722, the Assyrians went to war against the northern tribe of Israel and defeated them, and then sent them into exile, scattered them. And I guess most of these people just kind of intermarried into the surrounding nations and everything. But a very small number of them eventually came back, and they became what the New Testament refers to as the Samaritans. And they lived, I think, in the northern regions of Israel. I'm not really sure exactly where Samaria was. But I guess the Jewish people never really accepted them back as their own. And so Jews and Samaritans were kind of at odds with each other in the 1st century. And I guess this had been going on for a long time. But usually, most of those people just became lost. And if you've ever heard the phrase, the lost tribes of Israel, that's what that refers to. The lost 10 tribes. Mormons have, well, never mind about the Mormons. So now you've got just the southern kingdom of Judah. And this lasted all the way up until the Babylonians became like the hegemon over the region. And the Babylonians were from modern-day Iraq. And so around the 6th century, the Jewish people became, they were at animosity with the Babylonians and stuff, because the Babylonians were the hegemons, but the Jewish people still had their own king and stuff, but they weren't exactly independent. And so they had these wars with Nebuchadnezzar, and there were 3 exiles. And I don't remember who was exiled in each one of them. Sometimes it was just the ruling class, and sometimes it was some other class of people or whatever. But there were 3 of them. And the final one happened in 587. Some people say 586. And I think the reason for that is because the Babylonian calendar, you know, started and ended somewhere like in the middle of our calendar. So maybe there's ambiguity about whether it was 586 or 587. I'm not sure. But anyway, it was in that year that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple. And we actually do have Babylonian records about this. We have, there's artwork that shows the Babylonians carrying a lot of the dishes and stuff out of the temple, you know, the gold bowls and all kinds of stuff, to Babylon. And this is also when the Ark of the Covenant was lost. I didn't mention the Ark of the Covenant before, but that's basically this big box with these 2 angels on top of it. And the box is supposed to contain those tablets that Moses came down from the mountain, minus the one that he dropped. This is a joke, another dad joke. And Aaron's rod, I think, was in there. And there may have been something else in there that I don't remember. But anyway, that was lost. And I suspect the Babylonians dismantled it, melted down the gold or whatever. But some people believe it's still out there somewhere to be found. And that's what the Raiders of the Lost Ark is all about. So, put some pop culture in there. So anyway, this was kind of devastating to the Jewish people. Because remember, they had been promised that David's dynasty would last forever, and that they were promised this land forever, and the temple represented the presence of God. Now, all 3 of those things are gone, all at one moment. So you can imagine this was just, had to been devastated to them. You know, it had to almost destroy their worldview, because they had to question, well, did God really promise these things? And so what happened was they were in exile for 50 years. Now, some of you are saying, wait a minute, Sam, wasn't it 70 years? I read this book called The Gentile Times Reconsidered, And it made the point that in Jeremiah, where this prophecy about the 70 years comes up, the first event, I think it's Jeremiah 25, but I'm not totally sure. The 70 years were prophesied not for Israel, but for Babylon. It says 70 years are decreed for Babylon. In other words, Babylon would be like the hegemon or the world ruler or whatever for 70 years. Well, this 70 years began before the temple was destroyed. It began before that third exile. And so the exile actually lasted 50 years. And this makes a lot of sense because there were people alive at the end of that exile that still remembered the old temple and everything. If it was 70 years, almost all of those people would have been dead. And so, and a lot of those people would have to, live to be 120 years. I recommend that book, The Gentile Times Reconsidered, because it goes through all these prophecies about the exile, and it shows how they all cohere, and that in reality, the exile lasted 50 years. And Josephus, too, in one of his books, he said the exile was 70 years, but then in a subsequent book, he corrected himself and said it was 50 years. He must have done the math and figured it out. But anyway, so during the exile, there was a lot of literature written in the prophetic genre and in the apocalyptic genre. And basically the way the prophets interpreted these events is they believed that God would remain faithful to Israel. And his faithfulness meant that he would restore these promises, or he would restore all these things that were lost. They believed that the Jewish people had sinned, and that's why God allowed all these bad things to happen to them. In fact, it was God that sent the Babylonians to make this happen. And so they believed that eventually God would restore them. He would bring them back from everywhere that they had been exiled to, back to the land, and he would reestablish the throne of David. That's where the idea of the eschatological Messiah comes from. The idea that eventually there would be a descendant of David who would come reclaim the throne of David and rule forever. And the temple, some of the prophecies, the Messiah would rebuild the temple, and so they believed that all these promises would be restored in the eschaton, or in the last days, or something like that. And so after the 50 years were over, the Medes and the Persians, and I don't remember whether, some sources say that the Medes and Persians were really part of the same empire. Some people separate them. I'm not really sure. But anyway, when the exile ended, that's when the Babylonians were defeated by the Persians, or the Medes, or whatever, and they allowed the Jewish people to return to their land. And so they returned, and as you can imagine, there was a lot of dispute over who owned what land and who had what lineage, who had right to what. There were disputes and stuff, but they were also allowed to rebuild the temple. And during the rebuilding of the temple, there was this guy named Zerubbabel, who was a descendant of David, who was officiating over the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple and everything. So a lot of people got their hopes up that maybe this Zerubbabel guy was going to be the eschatological Messiah, but that never came to fruition. And so at this point, after the return from exile, everything was not restored. They did rebuild the temple, and they did return to their land, but there was still no Davidic Messiah. There was still no Davidic king. And the priests did continue to, they did kind of reestablish the priesthood and the sacrifices and everything. But everything was not as it should be, because they were still being ruled over by foreign countries. And so some people like N.T. Wright argue that they still thought of themselves as being kind of in exile. I put in exile in quotes because literally they were not in exile, but when you consider all the things they expected to happen as a result of coming out of exile, it did not all happen. So they still thought of themselves as kind of being in bondage. So around the 33 BC, this is when Alexander the Great went through the Middle East, and he conquered the Middle East, and he conquered Egypt, and he went all the way as far as India. Part of what he conquered, I guess, was he defeated the Persians, I guess, and he became the hegemon, or the Greeks became the hegemon, excuse me. And after he had done all this, he didn't live very long. And when he died, his kingdom that he had established was, he was from Macedonia, by the way. Macedonia was kind of basically Greece. The Greeks may not agree with that, but they were Greek-speaking people anyway. And so when he died, his kingdom was divided between his 4 generals. One of them was Ptolemy, and Ptolemy, I guess, ruled Egypt, Alexandria, that area. And then there was the Seleucids, or Seleucids, or something. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. And I'm not sure what all... I think the Seleucids became, they ruled over Israel, or the Judah, or whatever, Jerusalem, all that area. And at some point, the Ptolemies defeated the Seleucids, and they became the rulers. But anyway, around 300, some Jewish people decided that because these Greek people were really bent on importing or exporting their culture and their language and everything. And this process was called Hellenization. And they tried to get everybody to do it. And a lot of the Jewish people participated in this. They kind of liked the Greeks. And for example, the Greeks would open these gymnasiums where they would wrestle and do all the workout, do all the things they did completely in the nude. And the Jews who were circumcised would go in there and be embarrassed by it. And so they would perform these reverse circumcisions. And so a lot of these Jews were kind of adopting Greek ways, and a lot of the other Jews really didn't like it. You know, there were like the hardcore faithful Jewish people, and then there were the Jews who wanted to be more like the Greeks and stuff. And so so around 300, some Jewish people got together and decided we need to translate our scriptures into Greek. And up until then, it had all been written in Hebrew, with the exception of parts of Daniel and Ezekiel, which were written in Aramaic. Oh yeah, by the way, the Babylonians spoke Aramaic, and this is how the Jewish people came to speak Aramaic, is during this Babylonian period. And Aramaic became the predominant language in the homeland, Judea, during the 1st century. Most scholars think that Jesus' primary language was Aramaic. So anyway, the Greeks came, and they tried to import Greek. So the Jews they first translated the Torah, the first 5 books, into Greek. And there's this legend that there were 70 scholars who did these translations, and they all translated it independently of each other. And by a miracle, all of their translations were identical. And I think Josephus tells that story. But it became known as the Septuagint because of this legend about the 70 scholars. But between 300 and 1 BC, or by 1 BC, pretty much all of the Old Testament was eventually translated into Greek. And the whole translation became known as the Septuagint. So when you hear people talking about the Septuagint, they're referring to the whole Old Testament, even though originally it was just the 70 scholars in the first 5 books. So, and around 160, around 160 BC, there was this guy named Antiochus, who was, I guess, one of the Ptolemaic kings who was ruling from Egypt. I guess he was antagonizing the Jewish people, and the Jewish people were just getting fed up with it and stuff. And then eventually a series of events happened. I don't remember the details, but what ended up happening is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, or something like that. I don't know what Epiphanes means. But anyway, he's sometimes referred to as Antiochus IV, or Antiochus IV Epiphanes, or just Antiochus Epiphanes. But anyway, he went into the temple and he desecrated the temple by slaughtering a pig. Now, if you can imagine, the Jewish people don't eat pork. And pork is, seen as this really dirty thing. So to go in there and into the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest once a year is allowed to go, he went in there and slaughtered a pig on the altar, desecrated the temple. And He put an end to sacrifice and offerings. And this lasted like 3.5 years or something. And so in the meantime, the Jewish people were pretty upset about that. So there was this family who I think were part of the Levite tribe, who were priests, the Maccabees. They decided to fix things, and they did. They waged war and they won. I think this happened in 163. They waged war, and I think this happened a year after the desecration. I'm not really sure. But anyway, they won the war, and they rededicated the temple. And the rededication of the temple is what is now celebrated as Hanukkah. Hanukkah, or Chanukah, or however you pronounce it, Hanukkah, means rededication. So they rededicated the temple, they cleansed the temple and everything, and they got things going again. And now that they had kicked out the Ptolemies, for the first time since before the Babylonian exile, they actually did have autonomy. But the king was one of these Maccabees. I think it was Judas Maccabeus, who was the son of the guy who led this rebellion. And so he became both a king and a priest. And this was the beginning of the Hasmonean Dynasty. And this Hasmonean Dynasty lasted into the 1st century. And I'll get to that in a minute. But so from about 163 until around 63, so like 100 years, the Jewish people lived autonomously. But things were still not exactly how God promised them to be, because the Hasmonean kings were not Davidic kings. They were not the fulfillment of God's promise to always have a man on the throne of David. And so there was still a little bit of discomfort. But anyway, so around 63, there was a dispute that broke out, I think, between some Pharisees. I'm not really sure who the dispute was between. Maybe it was between some high priests, and they couldn't decide who was going to be high priest. I don't remember what the dispute was about. But Pompey, the Roman general Pompey, was going through the area at the moment. You know, he used to go through there on his way to Egypt. So they went to him to ask him to be the mediator to try to resolve their dispute. And so Pompey took advantage of the situation, and he kind of just quietly, non-violently took over. And so Rome became, Rome kind of incorporated the Jews into their, it wasn't an empire yet, their republic, I guess, at the time. But as was typical of Romans, they didn't have like a Roman ruler to rule directly. They allowed people to use their own system of government and everything, and to be semi-autonomous. They just had to pay taxes to Rome, and there were other things that they had to do. Some of the things that the Romans asked the Jews to do, the Jews didn't want to do because it violated their religious standards. The Jews were very anti-idolatry, for example, so they didn't want statues, and they didn't want flags bearing images of Caesar or whatever. They didn't want to participate in the imperial cult. There were things that they didn't want to do, and so this caused a little bit of tension. But the Romans were, what's the word? Conciliatory? Accommodating. So the Romans were accommodating for the most part with the Jewish people, allowing them to practice their religions. So around the 1st century BC, towards the end of it, Herod was the last of these Hasmonean kings. And the Jews did not like Herod because his grandmother was not Jewish. And so they thought of him as like a half-Jew. They called him a half-Jew as kind of a pejorative word. So they didn't like him at all. And he was extremely paranoid too. But he was like a satellite king under Rome. And he, I guess, probably he wanted to be seen by the Jewish people as kind of a semi-messiah or something. So he started doing all these renovations on the temple. And a lot of, when the Jews returned from exile and they built this temple, a lot of people who were alive during the first temple period were really disappointed by the second temple because it did not compare in glory to Solomon's temple. So fast forward to King Herod, and he wanted to do all these renovations to the temple and bring it up to speed, you know, make it like the first temple and everything. And I guess he had some success doing this because these renovations went on for decades. Herod was a very mean person. He killed members of his own family because he was paranoid. And I sometimes wonder if part of his paranoia was just that he was crazy, or was it because he realized people didn't like him very much. But anyway, when he died, his kingdom kind of thing was split between his sons. And one of them was Archelaus. I don't remember the names of all of his sons. But one of them was put in charge of Galilee, which was north of Judea. One of them was put in Judea. And I think there was maybe two other sons. I'm not sure. But the one who was put over Judea turned out to be really incompetent and really disliked by the Jewish people. So the Jewish people went to the Romans and says, can we get rid of this guy? And so in 6 AD, they got rid of him. And they replaced him with a Roman procurator. Now these people are sometimes called prefects of the equestrian order. And Pontius Pilate was one of these prefects, but he wasn't the first one. And so this is the first time that Israel didn't have a satellite king. Now they're being ruled directly by by Rome itself. And so these procurators that ruled over Judea were not sensitive at all to the Jewish way of life. They didn't really care for the Jews very much. So there was constant animosity between them, and there was constant things happening. For example, when Pontius Pilate became procurator in 26, I think, pretty sure it was 26, he came into Jerusalem with standards bearing images of Caesar, and he wanted to plant them there in Jerusalem. Well, the Jewish people did not like this at all, and so his little capital area was in Caesarea, which is a little bit away from Jerusalem. So they sent a bunch of Jewish people, you know, Pharisees, Sadducees, you know, a bunch of Jewish people went to Caesarea and pleaded with him for a number of days, I think 3 days or something, I'm not sure, to remove those standards because, you know, to them it was idolatry, and they've got idolatry right there in their holy city, you know, and so it was very offensive to them. And so Pilate refused to do it, and he got sick of them begging, and so he finally told his little military people to surround them and draw their swords. And so I guess from Pilate's point of view, he expected for the Jewish people to relent, but instead of relenting, they just all bore their necks like that, you know. They were ready to have their throats cut rather than allow Jerusalem to be desecrated with what they saw as idolatry. And so Pontius Pilate was kind of in a sticky situation here because he was there to govern, to keep the peace and all this kind of stuff. If he had slaughtered all these people, he probably would have lost his job. And so he couldn't do it. He relented. He gave in. But as you can imagine, this Pontius Pilate did not like the Jewish people at all. And he had no problem crucifying some of them if he could get away with it. So this caused a lot of animosity between him, and I think that this story sheds a lot of light on what the Gospels say happened between the Jewish people, because Pilate was trying to free Jesus, and the Jewish people were trying to, or the leaders were trying to have Jesus crucified, and eventually, I'm going to get to all that later, but that story right there, I think, sheds a lot of light on what happened in the Gospels, because a lot of people doubt what happened in the Gospels because Pilate was such a mean guy. He would have had no problem crucifying Jesus. Well, I think what he was trying to do was get back at the Jewish leaders, and he did it by I'm going to go into all detail about that. Anyway, so this animosity between these procurators and the Jewish people eventually erupted into this war that started in 66. And according to Josephus, what happened is, I think this final procurator was stealing money out of the treasury in the temple and stuff. And they were doing all kinds of things to offend the Jews constantly. So during this period of time, there were a lot of revolutionary movements, some of them small, some of them big, that you can understand was happening because it was very oppressive to the Jewish people to be ruled directly by Roman people who didn't like them very much. And these people were just really longing for all of God's promises to be finally to be fulfilled, for there to be a Messiah, a restoration of David's kingdom, to kick everybody out, to have national sovereignty, and to have this era of peace and prosperity that they were all hoping to have. And there were a bunch of different factions that arose. We don't know necessarily when each of them arose, but by the 1st century, you had the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Zealots, the Sicarii, the Essenes, and let me tell you a little bit about these different factions. The Sadducees, if you want to read some detail about these, there's a book by Jacob Neusner. I cannot remember the name of the book, but I'll give you it. Josephus talks a lot about these factions in his book, The Jewish Wars. N.T. Wright talks about it in the New Testament and the people of God. And actually most of the books I've read on the historical Jesus have some little section that talks about these factions. But I'm just going to try to talk about them as briefly as I can. The Sadducees were the ruling group. They kind of ran the temple and stuff. And they believed in the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, the Pentateuch, etc. They didn't accept the rest of the scriptures as being authoritative or coming from God or anything like that. So they didn't believe in resurrection. They didn't believe in an afterlife or anything like that. Well, these people kind of acted as the go-between between the Romans and the people. And so they were always trying to keep the peace, you know, they wanted to keep the Romans from attacking because they didn't want to lose their land. They didn't want to lose the temple that they had and everything. But they were also trying to keep the Jewish people quiet because the Jewish people were constantly wanting to revolt. And there was all these little movements that were coming up. So they were always kind of trying to stamp them out. So then you had the Pharisees. The Pharisees was more of a popular movement. It wasn't what you would think as like a denomination, you know, in Christianity or something like that. It wasn't an organization. It was just a movement. The Pharisees, among all the parties, were the most like Christians as far as what they believed and what they practiced and stuff. And they believed not only in the Torah, but in all the writings of the Old Testament, the prophets and all that kind of stuff. So they did believe in resurrection. They did believe in an afterlife. But in addition to the law that Moses gave to, or that God gave to Moses, they also believed that there was an oral Torah. And this oral Torah carried over into the Mishnah, which was, the oral Torah supposedly was written down in the Mishnah around 200. And then you have the Talmud, which was written down, I think, 200 years later, which was a commentary on the Mishnah. And so the Mishnah contains a lot of what the Pharisees allegedly considered the oral Torah. So the Pharisees believed that all of these promises that God had made were not realized because of disobedience. And so they thought that obedience to the Torah would make God, you know, would usher in, you know, all God's promises and stuff like that if they were just obedient. And so they were kind of innovative, and they came up with innovative ways to make it easier for the Jewish people to obey the Torah. The Gospels talk very negatively about the Pharisees, but if you just, what you're looking at when you look at that is just like a window, like a very narrow kind of window into the interactions between Jesus and the Pharisees. But if you just go on that alone, you'll get a distorted picture of the Pharisees. They were about more than what the Gospels portray them as being. So then you had the Zealots, and the Zealots had a lot of similar beliefs as the Pharisees. The difference between them is they were more of a political movement, and what they wanted to do is they wanted to have an armed revolt. And then you had the Sicarii, who were even more radical than the Zealots. Interestingly, one of Jesus's apostles was a Zealot. It doesn't talk a whole lot about him, but he was from this party. But the Essenes were like the Jewish version of Jehovah's Witnesses. They rejected the entire temple system, and they thought the entire nation of Israel had just gone astray, and they were the only true Israelites. And so they kind of lived by themselves in Qumran. If you heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls, Most scholars think that those Dead Sea Scrolls were a product of the Essenes. There's dispute. Some people make a distinction between the Essenes and the Qumran cult. I personally am convinced that the Essenes were the same people as the Dead Sea people, the Qumran cult. Because Josephus talks a lot about these people, and if you read, I've actually read a translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls translated by Geza Vermes, or Vermes, or however you pronounce his name. I read the 4th edition. I don't know how many editions there's been since then, because they've translated more things since then. But if you read that stuff, it sounds a lot like what Josephus described as being the Essenes. So I'm convinced that those are the Essenes. But they were a separatist group. And they believed in 2 messiahs. They believed that there would be a priestly messiah and a kingly messiah. But as far as messianic expectation of the 1st century, it was very high at the time because everybody wanted a deliverer. And so you had all these movements. Some of them were messianic movements. Some of them were quasi-messianic. Some were just prophets. Some of them were ambiguous. But you had all these movements. And in each case, the Romans would come down and squash the movement. Sometimes they'd kill some of the followers. And they would end, and then somebody else would come up. And so this happened, you know, all this civil unrest happened until the war finally broke out in 66. And they had one last hoorah in 135 or thereabouts when Simon Bar Kakhba was said by the Rabbi Akiba to be Bar Kakhba, which means son of the morning star, or son of the star, or something like that, which is a messianic title. So Akiba thought that Simon Bar Kakhba was the Messiah, and I guess there were enough Jewish people that believed it that they had a second war with Rome, and that's the war in which they completely lost their land and everything, and the Jews have been in exile. That's when the diaspora, the official diaspora, began. So they've been that way ever since, and unless you count 1949 and when they reestablished the nation of Israel. And if it's not 1949, I apologize. And I guess that's about all I wanted to say. I wanted to add one more thing. After the war with Rome, when they had the war with Rome between 66 and 70, it actually lasted to 74, or 73 or 74 if you count the fortress of Masada, which held out for a lot longer. But the war was basically over in 70. They destroyed the temple again, the second temple. And of course, this was devastating. This completely ended the Sadducees. Since the Sadducees' whole life revolved around the temple, there was no purpose for them anymore. The Essenes disappeared. Apparently, they just buried all the scrolls that they had in the caves of Qumran, and they weren't found again until the 1940s. They disappeared. And the only thing that was left was pretty much the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were the rabbis that eventually wrote down the Mishnah, and they became, like, I guess, the founders of the rabbinic movement, and that has kind of become what Judaism is all about ever since then. And I don't know a whole lot about Jewish history from that point on, so I don't know how it all developed, but anyway, that's all I have to say about the background information into which Jesus came into the world. So in the next stuff, I'll start getting into the historical stuff about Jesus. And there you have it.